you so much, Bauman, and thank all of you for being here this afternoon for this very, very important, indeed, historic gathering. As my friend Bauman just indicated, I have the honor of being on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council. And as you have heard, it's a very historic relationship between the Peace Council and the World Peace Council. We are a relatively new entity here in the U.S. anti-war and pro-peace movement. We have been organizing for the last 2 years. In fact, April the 4th will be the second anniversary of the Black Alliance for Peace. It is really fortuitous that we have the second anniversary on April the 4th, and that the World Peace Council is meeting here in this country, and the imperialist structure of NATO is celebrating its 7th anniversary. Because these streams come together and provide the context for the work and the struggle that we have to engage in. I'm so honored to be here with Al Mater, who's always been an inspiration for me. This morning when I got up and felt a little tired, thought about what we have to be facing these next few days, wondered if I had the stamina to keep going. When I come and I see Al and hear Al, and I'm reminded of his history, his dedication to this issue, it gives me the energy and inspiration to continue to struggle. Thank you so much. We have been talking about what appears to be a new phenomenon regarding the criminal entity, NATO, its expansion and participation in the so-called Global South. But my friends, this is not really something new. I just want to touch on this for a moment. You know, imperialism has a playbook that they will establish and go back to repeatedly. The expansion of NATO and the activity of NATO beyond the North Atlantic region was something that has been done in the past. It occurred many, many years ago on the African continent. We might recall, I think many of us can maybe recall this, that in the anti-colonial struggles on the African continent, you had most of the European countries that struck a neo-colonial bargain with the colonies and withdrew. But there was one empire, one nation that found it almost impossible to in fact do that. And that was the Portuguese. Because of the objective situation of that nation, they didn't find it in their best interest to give up their colonies or to strike a neo-colonial relationship and to withdraw. Instead, they decided they were going to struggle and to fight to maintain their colonial presence. In fact, they even tried to advance the fiction that they were not colonial masters, that the nations of Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, even though they were thousands of miles away from Portugal, they were in fact just their overseas territories. They were part of Portugal. So they decided they were going to struggle and fight to maintain their overseas territories. Now, this was a moment in 1961 that the new administration of the John Kennedy was projecting a new position on Africa. They said that they were going to support the anti-colonial movements on the continent. They said that colonialism was something that was dead and that Europe had to move on. But while Kennedy took that position in the public, we know that the administration, working through NATO, provided the material means in order to allow the Portuguese to engage in a murderous struggle to try to maintain their colonial empire. And they did just that for more than a decade. This playbook of operating through NATO as part of the collective imperialism that Kwame Nkrumah talked about continues to this day. It is important for us to understand that the contradiction we are facing globally today is a contradiction between the vast majority of the people of this planet and what we refer to in the Black Alliance for Peace as the axis of domination. The axis of domination represents the US, EU, and NATO. This axis of domination is committed to maintaining its global hegemony. They are committed to fighting to the last drop of your blood and mine to maintain that global hegemony. So our responsibility is to engage the people of this country, to demonstrate to the people of this country their responsibility, not only to themselves, but to the planet. And that's what we intend to do. One of the things that we had to face when we understood the nature of NATO many, many years ago was that we in fact had to fight against that entity. When I was in the US military more than 40 years ago, that's when I had a chance to really understand the nature of this structure. Because it was then when we discovered that in a covert way, the US was in fact providing support to the Portuguese through NATO in order for the Portuguese to murder African people. I was assigned to an aviation company in the US Army, and we discovered that the aviation company was in fact training Portuguese pilots through NATO so that those pilots can go back to Africa and in fact kill black folks. And we organized an action, a sit-down strike, to oppose the participation of the U.S. in providing that kind of support to these gangsters in NATO. So we understood then, as we have to understand today, that this entity is not an entity that should be celebrated, but one that has to be opposed. And that's what makes it so obscene what is going to unfold in these few days here in this country, with the head of NATO being brought into the Congress before a joint session of Congress to be celebrated. It is obscene and contradictory when one looks at and remembers that just a few months ago we had this national conversation around gun violence here in this country. And we had the Democrats and many liberals who pretended to be so outraged by violence, gun violence here in this country, who targeted the National Rifle Association. But yet these same liberals and Democrats are lining up to celebrate NATO. But we say that NATO is only the flip side of the NRA. Both represent militarism and a commitment to war and to violence. So we've got to point out these contradictions. We've got to engage the people and try to appeal to their ability to think and see things as they are. We've got to ensure that this issue of militarism and violence and war becomes a central component of the discourse related to the elections of 2020. We cannot allow anybody in this country to define themselves as a so-called progressive or even a radical and not take a stance against NATO and U.S. imperialism. We can't do that any longer. So my friends, we have work to do. We have work to do to engage the population, to ensure that this issue becomes something that's debated. We've got to point people toward the work that we need to engage in terms of educating people around the reality of the U.S. and NATO presence globally, bring them into the fold of this new campaign that we have organized, engage the folks and help people to understand that we don't have to be limited by what we are facing today, that there indeed is an alternative, that we can go beyond war and militarism, that we can build a new world. So my friends, we have work to do. Let's discuss today how we move strategically to in fact do that, and understand that, remind ourselves that we are in fact on the right side of history and that we will win.